Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, South Africa goes after the Guptas. One of the wealthy businessmen caught up in a corruption crackdown contests a 10 million rand asset freeze. The Gupta family is accused of having grown its empire on backhanders and favours from former President Jacob Zuma. Also, Burkinabay filmmaker Idrissa Ouedraogo is hailed as an immense talent after passing away aged 64. The prolific producer made dozens of films over his career. And worn, faded, or simply hard to come by, Malagasy photos were all but off limits for most people on the island, but thousands of historical pieces have now been tracked down and restored for display as the country's first photography museum prepares to open its doors. But first, South African authorities have ramped up their anti-corruption investigations into the Gupta family. The three brothers are accused of having amassed some of their wealth and business interests through exploitation of corrupt relationships with former President Jacob Zuma. He quit last week. 8 people, including one Gupta family member, have since appeared in court as part of a probe into suspected embezzlement of state funds meant for a dairy project. In connection to that, one of the Gupta brothers, Atul, on Monday challenged a 10 million rand asset freeze. Ashlyn Lang tells us more.
So effectively, the allegation is that in 2013, the provincial government came up with a plan to set up a dairy that would provide jobs in a very impoverished area in the rural Free State. At some point, a company that is linked to the Guptas came along and took on the burden of setting up this dairy, except that the provincial government instead paid money to a company linked to the Guptas, about 1.7 million euros. And that money eventually, much of it ended up funding a lavish wedding for one of the Guptas' nieces in Sun City.
So what can you tell us about any other corruption investigations that have sprung up since Zuma's fall last week?
Well, I mean, we've sort of seen movements from the Hawks, which is the elite anti-corruption arm of the South African police, since Cyril Ramaphosa was elected to the ANC presidency in December. This is one of the investigations that they've made known they're pursuing. Another is an investigation into McKinsey, the international consultancy firm that tied up with a company called Trillion, a local company, which is also linked to the Guptas, run by a close associate of theirs. Between them, they provided a sort of turnaround strategy for the very struggling state power company Eskom, and it extracted vast fees from that company without actually, in the end, having provided a great deal of assistance. Subsequently, it was found that due process wasn't followed, that Eskom was advised very strongly not to get into this deal, and yet, apparently because of collusion between people on both sides of the fence, vast amounts of money was extracted from the state-owned power company, leaving it in such a precarious position that at one point it was felt that it could bring down the entire South African economy. And in the end, South African civil servant pensions were used to bail it out.
So are the Guptas being made an example of with all these investigations that have sprung up since Ramaphosa was made head of the ANC?
I mean, yes, I think certainly this case has been seized on to make very clear that the new dispensation will absolutely not tolerate corruption. But really, the Guptas have been at the centre of what's known as state capture for a good 3 or 4 years now. There are many people around them that have been targeted, and we haven't actually seen their arrests yet, although it's understood that they are most likely abroad and perhaps they will never be brought to justice. However, many of their key lieutenants who ran their sort of more legitimate operations have been detained. And I think it does send a very strong message.
Ashlyn Lang there for us in Cape Town. Look now at some news in brief. Thousands of people gathered in Harare on Monday to pay their respects to the late leader of the opposition MDC party. Morgan Tsvangirai died of cancer last week and is due to be buried in his home of Beira on Tuesday. His career was defined by his rivalry with former President Robert Mugabe. Tsvangirai and his supporters often faced violence in their opposition to Mugabe's 30 years as leader. The late statesman's passings opened up divisions within the MDC, and some officials have called for the party to pull together out of respect for Tsvangirai's legacy. Talks have begun between Togo's government and the opposition coalition after a 6-month political standoff that has sparked almost weekly protests against the ruling party. President Fauna Singbe has been in power since 2005, and his critics are calling on him to quit and bring in constitutional reform. Negotiations, which are due to last 10 days, are expected to tackle demands for the reintroduction of constitutional limits on presidential mandates. Dialogues being mediated by Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo and Guinea's leader Alpha Condé. At least 17 people were killed in Maputo on Monday after heavy rains caused a 15-metre-high pile of rubbish to collapse. Emergency workers are searching for survivors, but fear that more people could still be buried underneath. 7 illegally built houses were destroyed in the garbage slide in the Hulini dump. It's the largest in the city, and officials say that they had asked residents living there to leave and had been in the process of discussing closure of the site. Now, one of Africa's most influential directors has died in Burkina Faso at the age of 64. Idrissa Ouedraogo passed away in Ouagadougou on Sunday. During his career, he produced more than 40 films, many of which had Burkinabay stories at their heart.
Idrissa Ouedraogo was a towering giant of African cinema. He produced or directed some 40 films, which often looked at the conflicts between traditional and modern lifestyles on the continent. This film, Tilai, won him international acclaim, winning an award at the Cannes Film Festival in 1990. Ouedraogo's career started with a bang. He graduated from film school in 1981. It was the year that one of his short features, Poco, picked up the top award at Africa's biggest film festival. In 1986, his first feature film, Yam Dabo, The Choice, hit cinemas. The tale of a poor family that fled their poverty-stricken village in the Sahel Desert. Idrissa Ouedraogo, one of the few African directors to have worked at the prestigious Comédie Française in Paris, died after a short illness. He was 64.
Now, Madagascar's first museum of photography opens this week. It's the first time the historical work of local artists will be collectively displayed. Until now, Malagasy photography was dispersed between national galleries, archives and private collections in France and Madagascar. Gael Borja tells us more about this rare look back at the country's photographic heritage.
For this Malagasy historian, 4 rooms like this one have been especially equipped to project a collection of digitized photos. This is Madagascar's first museum of photography. Overwhelmed, Héliant Taradonarson, curator of the museum, is discovering the ultra-modern space for the first time. Relief. After 5 years of work, she finally got 5,000 photographs carefully collected from various institutions and individuals, digitized, some converted to video, on the walls of the museum. And there was no time to lose. Historic Malagasy photographs were at risk of disappearing for good, collecting dust, forgotten in drawers, damaged and sometimes even stolen. This Madagascar-born Belgian businessman decided to donate thousands of euros to the museum project.
I have always been interested in the concept of heritage, and the fact that this heritage was disappearing pained me, even though it is not so difficult to preserve it thanks to modern technology. These photographic roots are roots that speak to everyone. There are books that exist, but they are sometimes long and difficult to read, whereas showing a photo of the capital 100 years ago speaks to a child the same way it speaks to an intellectual.
One major problem, though, the origin of half the photos is unknown. With help from researchers and the general public, the association hopes to document and piece together the country's historic heritage.
Some people might see the pictures and think, well, it's just an old photo. I don't. I look at the fabrics, the cloths, the lace. I see every single detail. Photos are treasures, where you can find a lot of things, just like in a mystery box. History can be told through photography. You can write history with photos.
A photographic journey into Madagascar's history that will be offered free of charge to a classroom of pupils once a week.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again. Take care. Bye.